She ended up among criminals. He couldn't look away. How will their forbidden encounter end?
In the shadowed, cold walls of Maplewood Women's Correctional Facility, life was a monochrome of fear, routine, and endless tension. Stories of light and hope were rare here, whispered in secret, almost mythical. Yet one day, the gray monotony was pierced by the arrival of a woman who seemed entirely out of place. Emily Carson, a young nurse with eyes that seemed to hold both strength and softness, stepped into the unforgiving world of hardened criminals. She was accused of something she had never done, and the prison offered no immediate relief or sympathy. From the very first moment, it was clear. Survival here would demand more than just courage. It would demand cunning, patience, and restraint. Emily's first steps in the infirmary were cautious. The antiseptic smell mingled with the faint metallic scent of blood, a constant reminder of the place's harshness. Inmates passed by, sizing her up with cold, appraising eyes, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some were curious, some hostile, and some simply indifferent, hardened by years behind bars. Emily felt a surge of anxiety, her pulse quickening as she realized she had no allies here, no one to shield her. Every movement mattered, every glance could carry unintended meaning. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. At the end of the hall, Jonathan Hayes, the warden of Maplewood, observed her carefully. He had spent years maintaining order, overseeing inmates who had long since lost any sense of humanity or softness in their eyes. He was a man of control and discipline, accustomed to commanding attention and respect without needing to raise his voice. Yet when his gaze fell on Emily, something shifted. She radiated an unusual combination of resilience and vulnerability, an aura that seemed to defy the prison's oppressive atmosphere. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt a stir of curiosity, and perhaps something more profound. Their first encounter was brief, yet charged. Emily approached him with a careful bow of her head, offering documents she had been asked to deliver. "Good morning, Warden Hayes," she said, her voice calm, yet carrying a subtle tension. Jonathan studied her expression, noting the way her fingers trembled slightly as she held the papers. "Good morning, Ms. Carson," he replied, his tone steady, but not cold. There was an unspoken acknowledgment in his eyes, a recognition of the precariousness of her situation, and a hint of interest he could not entirely suppress. As the days passed, Emily began to understand the rules and rhythms of Maplewood. The inmates had their hierarchies, alliances, and unspoken codes, and the staff had theirs. Every interaction was layered, every glance potentially significant. She observed quietly, learning who could be trusted, who might exploit her, and who simply existed in a state of indifference. Her presence brought a subtle tension to the infirmary. She was competent, efficient, and unafraid, yet she carried a lightness that contrasted sharply with the oppressive darkness of her surroundings. Jonathan, in turn, found himself drawn to her beyond professional curiosity. He watched her movements, noted the way she interacted with the inmates with cautious empathy, and felt a stirring of feelings he had long suppressed. Authority and desire collided within him, creating a tension that was both exhilarating and dangerous. He knew he had to maintain his composure, his role as warden, yet the pull toward Emily was undeniable. Every brief exchange, every shared glance began to form a silent, delicate connection that neither could articulate, but both could feel. The infirmary became their shared stage, a place where subtle communication took precedence over words. A touch of a hand while adjusting bandages, a fleeting look across the room, the quiet exchange of instructions all became a language they alone understood. The stakes were high. One misstep could expose them to scrutiny, yet the unspoken bond continued to grow, invisible to all but the two participants. Each day, the line between professional duty and personal intrigue blurred, weaving a complex tapestry of tension, desire, and unspoken longing. Emily began to experience moments of introspection, realizing that her feelings for Jonathan were more than professional respect or admiration. The intensity of his gaze, the rare softness behind his stern demeanor, the subtle concern he displayed, each instance resonated deeply within her. She struggled with the implications. To acknowledge her feelings openly would be reckless, potentially disastrous, yet suppressing them felt equally impossible. Jonathan faced a parallel struggle. His authority demanded detachment, yet his heart and mind rebelled against the rigid confines of his role. Observing Emily, seeing her navigate the perilous corridors of Maplewood with grace and courage, he felt emotions that were both exhilarating and terrifying. The prison, which had always represented control and order, now became a backdrop for an internal conflict he could neither resolve nor ignore. Their connection deepened with each passing day. The simple acts of routine, checking medical supplies, exchanging brief instructions, administering treatment, all became imbued with layers of tension and subtle intimacy. Inmates and staff alike sensed something unusual, though none could articulate it clearly. The air of unspoken secrecy hung heavily in the corridors, a delicate balance of attraction, risk, and desire. Days in Maplewood passed in a rhythm of monotony and subtle observation, yet each day brought a quiet intensity to Emily's life. She learned to navigate the hallways, to anticipate the moods of the inmates, and to manage the fragile balance between maintaining authority and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Every interaction with Jonathan Hayes became a study in restraint, an exercise in subtlety. Their moments together were often brief. A shared glance as he inspected the infirmary, a fleeting exchange of words, but each was laden with unspoken meaning, charged with a tension neither could deny.
Emily found herself thinking of him during moments when she was alone, in the quiet of her small living quarters or as she prepared medical supplies. The memory of his gaze lingered, the echo of his voice resonated in her mind, and the awareness of their forbidden connection filled her with both exhilaration and apprehension. She knew that their bond existed in a precarious space, a narrow margin between discretion and exposure, yet she could not ignore it. Jonathan experienced the same torment. He reminded himself constantly of his duties, the expectations placed upon him, the consequences of letting personal feelings interfere with his role. Yet every time Emily moved within his line of sight, every time she spoke in that calm, controlled tone, the walls of his professional detachment weakened. His stern demeanor, honed over years of authority, clashed with the intensity of the emotions she provoked. He was aware that indulging even a fraction of desire could compromise his position, yet the pull toward her was magnetic, unrelenting, impossible to resist. The infirmary became their shared sanctuary, a place where time seemed to stretch and compress in unusual ways. Amid the antiseptic smell, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and the quiet footsteps of passing inmates, Emily and Jonathan found fleeting opportunities to communicate. A slight brush of hands while arranging bandages, a quick glance over medical charts, a soft word uttered under the guise of instruction. Each act was a careful negotiation between secrecy and intimacy. In these moments, the prison walls ceased to dominate their attention. All that mattered was the subtle language they were creating together. Even as their bond deepened, the external pressures remained relentless. Inmates whispered, curious about the newcomer and the unusual dynamic between her and the warden. Staff members noticed the faint, almost imperceptible signals, looks held just a second too long, gestures that suggested a familiarity beyond professionalism. Yet, despite the scrutiny, the connection persisted. The tension of secrecy amplified the intensity of their interactions, creating a web of subtlety and emotion that was almost tangible. Emily began to notice patterns in Jonathan's behavior, the way he lingered slightly longer near the infirmary, the careful choice of words when addressing her, the subtle protective glances he cast toward her, all signaled that their connection was not one-sided. She felt a complex mixture of fear, anticipation, and longing, realizing that the emotional stakes were as high as the physical risks. Every moment carried weight, and the simple act of being near him became a charged experience. Jonathan, in turn, became increasingly attuned to her subtle cues. He observed the flicker of her eyes, the tilt of her head, the tension in her shoulders, and learned to interpret these signs as messages in a silent dialogue. Each interaction became an exercise in careful restraint, yet every restrained moment only heightened the unspoken desire between them. They were engaged in a delicate dance of emotion, one that required precision, subtlety, and courage. Their relationship was defined by absence as much as by presence. Moments of separation were filled with anticipation and memory. Emily recalled the firmness of his stance, the quiet authority in his voice, the rare softness in his gaze. Jonathan replayed each gesture, each word, each fleeting touch, finding solace and temptation in the memory. Their connection thrived in the gaps, the pauses, the fleeting moments where time and attention could be theirs alone.
The risk was always present. Every interaction carried the potential for exposure. Inmates could misinterpret their behavior. Staff could notice inconsistencies, and one slip could unravel everything. Yet paradoxically, the risk made each encounter more intense. Every glance, every word, every carefully measured gesture became a testament to the strength of the bond they were cultivating. The tension was palpable, and the forbidden nature of their relationship made it all the more intoxicating. Even as they acknowledged the danger, neither could resist the pull. Each clandestine encounter, each shared moment of understanding created an invisible thread that drew them together. The prison walls, meant to contain and restrict, had inadvertently become the backdrop for a connection that defied rules, expectations, and reason. Emily and Jonathan were entangled in a story that was simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, intimate and precarious, fleeting and profound. The narrative unfolded slowly, like a delicate web of emotion and suspense. Viewers would witness every stolen glance, every subtle touch, every unspoken exchange, and understand the depth of the tension that defined their relationship. It was a love story hidden within the rigid confines of authority and confinement, a tale of desire tempered by fear, and an exploration of what it means to connect profoundly with another human being in circumstances that forbid it. As days turned to weeks at Maplewood, the rhythm of prison life seemed both endless and strangely intimate for Emily and Jonathan. Every corner of the infirmary held the possibility of subtle communication. Every routine task became an opportunity for a glance or a word laden with unspoken meaning. Emily moved with a careful grace, conscious of every detail, yet her awareness of Jonathan's presence added a layer of excitement she could neither fully understand nor resist. Jonathan, meanwhile, wrestled constantly with his dual roles as warden and, increasingly, a man drawn by desire. Each encounter with Emily challenged the careful equilibrium he had maintained for years. He was aware of every rule, every boundary, but the magnetic pull she exerted on him was undeniable. Her presence softened his stern demeanor, eliciting moments of introspection and vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to experience. Their moments together were fleeting, yet they left indelible marks on both. A brush of fingers over a medical chart, a shared smile when no one else was watching, a brief pause in conversation where their eyes locked, each became a language of its own. It was in these subtle, almost imperceptible gestures that they communicated more than words ever could. The intensity of their connection was amplified by the ever-present threat of exposure. The tension of secrecy only made each moment more intoxicating, each interaction more electric. Inmates and staff alike began to sense something unusual. Emily's confidence and quiet command of the infirmary drew attention. Jonathan's attentiveness, normally precise and professional, took on an almost protective tone whenever she was near.
The subtle dance of power and attraction did not go unnoticed, yet the exact nature of their relationship remained hidden, veiled behind the ordinary operations of the prison. This concealment only heightened the allure and danger of their connection. Emily found herself contemplating the consequences of her feelings. The line between professional duty and personal emotion was thin, and crossing it could bring disaster. Yet the pull she felt toward Jonathan was inescapable. Every look, every word, every carefully measured interaction reinforced the depth of her emotions. The prison, which had seemed cold and unyielding, became a backdrop for a clandestine intimacy that defied rules and expectations. Jonathan, too, felt the weight of possibility pressing upon him. His position demanded discipline and impartiality, yet he found himself bending, ever so slightly, toward Emily. The subtle brush of her hand, the tilt of her head when she listened to his instructions, the quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding, all were sparks igniting a fire he could neither control nor extinguish. He knew that indulging these emotions was dangerous, yet resisting them felt equally impossible. The infirmary, once just a place of work, became their sanctuary. Within its antiseptic walls, the fluorescent lights casting stark shadows, they found moments of connection that transcended the physical confines of Maplewood. Each fleeting touch, each prolonged gaze carried the weight of unspoken promises, of desires restrained, of emotions neither dared to fully express. It was a delicate balance, a dance on the edge of revelation, where the smallest misstep could shatter the fragile equilibrium they had cultivated. Emily and Jonathan developed a rhythm, an understanding that went beyond words. Each gesture, each glance, each silent acknowledgement was part of a carefully choreographed interaction that spoke volumes. Their connection was subtle, yet profound. Invisible to those not attuned to its intricacies, yet unmistakably powerful to each other. In the world outside, the prison remained a place of rules and containment, but within the infirmary, it was a stage for a private, intense story of desire, caution, and connection. Even the smallest interruptions, footsteps in the hallway, the shuffle of an inmate's shoes, the distant sound of a guard's voice, heightened their awareness and added layers to the tension. Every encounter was a negotiation between longing and restraint, between the forbidden and the unavoidable. The very risks they faced served to intensify the connection, forging a bond that was at once exhilarating and perilous. In this crucible of control and secrecy, Emily and Jonathan discovered the delicate, intoxicating power of clandestine attraction. Their shared moments became a tapestry of emotion, suspense, and quiet intimacy, woven carefully between the demands of authority and the constraints of prison life. It was in these moments, fleeting yet unforgettable, that they truly connected, understanding each other in ways words could not convey. The story, though silent in many of its exchanges, spoke loudly through tension, through subtle cues, through the charged atmosphere that surrounded every shared glance. Viewers would witness the silent drama unfold, seeing not just what was said, but what remained unspoken. Emotions and desires hovering in the air, waiting for the next carefully orchestrated encounter. The rhythm of Maplewood had begun to change for Emily. What once felt like a monotonous repetition of duties now carried an undercurrent of anticipation. Every morning as she entered the infirmary,
She wondered whether Jonathan would pass by, whether their eyes would meet, whether there would be a moment, brief, but theirs alone. Each day held the possibility of something small yet monumental, and that possibility gave her strength. Jonathan felt the same pull. He tried to busy himself with paperwork, inspections, and the countless details of running the prison, yet his mind drifted inevitably toward Emily. He would find excuses to stop by the infirmary, ostensibly to check supplies, to review security protocols, or to discuss medical procedures with her. Yet beneath the surface of those reasons lay a truth he could not deny. He wanted to see her, to hear her voice, to feel the quiet reassurance that her presence brought. One evening, as the corridors echoed with the fading sounds of locked doors and distant voices, Jonathan lingered near the infirmary longer than usual. Emily was alone, organizing medical records, her hair loosely tied, a few strands falling against her face. The fluorescent light above cast stark shadows, but within those shadows, Jonathan saw her not as a staff member under his supervision, but as the woman who had unsettled his carefully constructed world. Their conversation that night was brief, but different. There was a pause, a silence heavy with unspoken words. Jonathan's voice, normally commanding and precise, softened as he asked if she was managing well. Emily, caught off guard by the gentleness in his tone, met his gaze for a second longer than she should have. That second stretched, expanded, and became something neither of them could easily dismiss. It was in moments like these that their bond grew stronger, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small stolen fragments of intimacy. A word spoken in a softer tone, a hand that brushed too close, a glance that lingered. Each one was a secret kept between them, a thread woven into the fabric of their connection. Yet the risks grew equally. Whispers circulated among the inmates. Some had noticed Jonathan's frequent visits. Others remarked on the way Emily's presence seemed to command his attention. Though nothing concrete could be proven, speculation alone was dangerous in an environment where information was traded like currency. The walls of Maplewood held ears, and rumors could become weapons. Emily was aware of the danger, but found herself unable to retreat. She could have distanced herself, could have chosen to bury her emotions beneath duty and discipline. But every time Jonathan looked at her with that fleeting softness, every time she felt the subtle warmth of his presence, she knew that retreat was impossible. She was already too far involved, too deeply entangled in something larger than fear. Jonathan, too, battled his conscience. He reminded himself of the risks, the scrutiny of his staff, the fragile balance of authority, the consequences if their connection were exposed. But the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became. Emily represented something beyond desire. She was a reminder of his own humanity, of the man behind the title and the responsibilities. And that reminder was something he could not relinquish.
Their relationship, though still unspoken, began to shape the way they interacted with the world around them. Emily carried herself with a quiet confidence, bolstered by the knowledge of their secret connection. Jonathan, though still stern and disciplined in his duties, found moments of unexpected gentleness slipping through. Their bond, though hidden, began to leave traces in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they simply existed in the same space. It was late one evening, in the silence of the infirmary, that their restraint faltered. Emily was reviewing supplies, her back turned, When Jonathan stepped closer than usual, she felt his presence before she saw him, the weight of his gaze pressing into the quiet air. When she turned, their eyes met, and in that moment, the unspoken became undeniable. Neither spoke, yet everything was said in that gaze. Fear, longing, restraint, and desire collided in a silence more powerful than words. Jonathan's hand hovered near hers on the counter, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Emily's breath caught, and for a brief second, the walls of Maplewood faded away. There was no prison, no rules, no danger, only two souls standing on the edge of something impossible to resist. The moment passed, as it always had to. Footsteps in the hallway, the clang of metal against metal, a reminder of the world outside their secret. But something had shifted. They could no longer pretend that what existed between them was mere coincidence, mere imagination. The truth was alive, undeniable, and it had taken root deep within both of them. That night, Emily lay awake in her quarters, the memory of Jonathan's nearness burning in her mind. Jonathan, in his office, found himself staring at unfinished reports, his thoughts consumed by the memory of her eyes meeting his. They were caught in a storm of emotion, one that neither duty nor fear could fully contain. Their story was no longer just a collection of glances and subtle gestures. It was becoming something more, a dangerous, intoxicating connection that defied reason and demanded acknowledgement. The question was no longer whether they felt it. The question was how long they could keep it hidden.
The days that followed were charged with a new kind of electricity. Emily and Jonathan moved through their routines as before, careful, cautious, yet the memory of that near touch lingered between them. Every glance now carried weight. Every silence throbbed with possibility. It was no longer something they could dismiss. It had grown into a presence that followed them, even in solitude. Emily tried to convince herself that she could manage it, that she could bury the longing beneath her responsibilities, that she could shield herself with professionalism. But each time Jonathan entered the infirmary, her resolve weakened. His presence was too commanding, too magnetic, and the unspoken bond between them had already taken root too deeply. Jonathan, in turn, found himself slipping further into conflict. He was a man of rules, of order, of absolute control. Yet when he thought of Emily, all that control seemed fragile, almost meaningless. She had become the one breach in the fortress he had built around himself, and despite the risks, he could not bring himself to seal it. One evening, the storm broke. The prison had fallen into its nightly rhythm, doors locked, voices muted, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Emily remained in the infirmary, completing her reports. Jonathan appeared at the doorway, his presence filling the room even before he spoke. There was no reason for him to be there, no official matter to discuss, and yet he lingered. Emily looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was dense, heavy with everything left unsaid. Then Jonathan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His voice, low and steady, carried both authority and vulnerability. "Emily," he said quietly, her name sounding strange in the emptiness of the room. "We can't keep doing this." Her heart raced, but she held his gaze. "I know," she whispered. Her voice trembled, betraying the truth she didn't want to stop. The space between them seemed to collapse. Jonathan's hand hovered near hers on the desk, just as it had before. But this time, he did not pull back. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative at first, then with deliberate intent. The contact was slight, almost innocent, yet it sent a shiver through both of them. Emily drew in a sharp breath, the world around them dissolving into irrelevance. Jonathan leaned closer, the shadows from the sterile lights stretching across his face. His eyes searched hers, as though asking for permission, for absolution. And then, at last, the restraint shattered. Jonathan's hand moved to hers fully, their fingers intertwining with a desperate honesty. Emily's lips parted, and for a moment, the prison was no longer walls and bars. It was a cage they had both chosen to escape together, if only in spirit. Their connection, long buried beneath duty and fear, surfaced with undeniable force.
But the moment, like all forbidden things, was fleeting. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, a sharp reminder of where they were, of the dangers they faced. They broke apart instantly, hearts pounding, breaths uneven. The silence that followed was louder than any words could have been. Jonathan straightened, his expression torn between command and confession. Emily turned back to her papers, her hands trembling, her mind reeling. Nothing had been spoken outright, yet everything had been revealed. From that night onward, there was no more pretending. Their secret was alive, breathing between them in every room, every corridor, every stolen glance. The prison, once a place of rigid order, had become a theater of risk and longing. Every decision carried weight. Every choice drew them closer to exposure, or closer to surrendering completely. Emily knew the dangers, her reputation, her position, her very future. Jonathan knew the risks to his authority, his career, his control over Maplewood. But both also knew something deeper, that what they had stumbled into was rare, fragile, and, in its own way, undeniable. Their love, or whatever it was becoming, was a paradox. It thrived in silence, yet demanded acknowledgement. It existed in shadows, yet sought light. It was forbidden, dangerous, and yet, for both of them, it was the most alive they had felt in years. Whether it would survive, whether it would destroy them, neither could say. But as the night stretched on and their hearts beat louder against the silence of Maplewood's walls, one truth became impossible to ignore. Some connections cannot be contained, no matter how high the walls, no matter how strict the rules. And for Emily and Jonathan, the story was only just beginning.